Hey there everybody. Before I get started with today's video, remember, if you want to help my channel grow, help it get to an even better place than it is already, you can like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon page, links in the description if you want to help me out that way. It all helps the channel grow, and it helps allow me to continue producing content as much as I want to for this channel and to help it just continue to grow and grow and grow. So thank you in advance. And all that said, let's get to today's video. Hi there everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian. How are you all doing this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever part of the day it happens to be for you right now? I've been putting out some more content in my mystery murder series, going back and assessing cases that I found information for but never did any videos on, posting some videos that I'd had saved up, and I've been given, multiple instances where I've wanted to kind of stop this series because I've had people come at me, especially in the case of one particular video that I did. That's probably the only video I've taken down due to pretty much being harassed about it. But regardless of all of that, these stories deserve to be told, and just because they're a little bit older, the fact that these are unsolved instances of people either dying, disappearing, or being discovered and unidentified, what have you. These stories deserve to be told, and so I'm pushing forward. And the story that I'm going to bring to you in this episode is tragically, pretty much information on it is almost non-existent unless you go back and search for newspaper articles about it. I did an online search and there's barely anything. There's the reference to this as a cold case on Marion County as cold case, the collection of cold cases they have on their website. There's maybe a reference or two shared on Facebook, but otherwise there's practically nothing about this case. Almost all the information I got on this case, I got by digging in and finding old newspaper articles in relation to it going back to the mid-1970s. And this is also a case that I did a video on about 2 years ago. And shortly after finishing it, I discovered a few new articles, some information I didn't know prior, and all of a sudden the video that I had done began feeling incomplete. And so I took it down. I posted it briefly and then took it down and never put it back up. And I just knew at some point I was going to want to reassess this case, especially with how obscure it's ended up being, which is so interesting. It came at this time where in the Salem, kind of Corvallis-Salem area, during the latter part of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, there was so many tragic murders that happened to young women, a good chunk of which have never been solved, and this case fits into that as well. And I've covered a lot of these cases in prior videos. The murder victims of William Scott Smith. I did a video about two girls, Stephanie Ann Newsom and Ann Ellenwood, who vanished from the Salem Corvallis area. And this case fits in with those as well. And again, because this case is so obscure, you can find so little information about it online. I doubt there's another YouTube video that addresses it even. So I have a lot of emotional investment. The more obscure the case, the more I really feel I need to address it and put it back out there and get someone's attention with it, regardless of how old the case is. And that being said, let's get into it with the 1975 murder of 17-year-old teenager Tina Michelle Migis. This here is the one and only image I've been able to find of Tina Michelle Migis, who in 1975, she was 17 years old. She was living in Portland. I read two altering accounts. One said that she was living with her sister and her brother-in-law, so I'm assuming her sister's husband. Other articles said she was simply living in foster care. So I don't know if maybe foster care was, maybe she was, those are the two pieces of information I found. And she was a reoccurring runaway, apparently going all the way back to when she was 12 years old. And this was extremely common back during this time. I'm sure it was common in various other parts around the country, but in Oregon in particular, especially along I-5, you know, going from Portland down to California or even up into Washington, a lot of young women, teenage women, who were hitchhiking continuously and putting themselves potentially in some kind of danger. So Tina was a reoccurring runaway, and there's not a whole lot of information that's provided about her background in terms of how she grew up. So it would be, it's easy to say, oh, she must have had a horrible upbringing that would lead her to be so flippant about life and to take such risks and to be a runaway at such a young age. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of things that go into what makes a child want to run away. And sometimes these children are in pretty solid households. It's impossible to say exactly what led Tina to becoming such a reoccurring runaway at such a young age without knowing the information. And I did notice that in a later article written in the mid-90s that she was described as an alcoholic and a drug user by essentially the sheriff of the county police, one of the high-up people who would have been, you know, looking into her crime, describing her as an alcoholic and a drug user. I found no references to that in any other information I found on the case. Now, granted, the information is minimal, but where did this information come from? And you know, I don't know if I believe that. It was very easy, you know, when the young, you know, teenage kids were running away all the time. It was real easy to say that they were caught up in all forms of, quote, deviant lifestyles, you know, having sex with whoever, doing whoever's handing you drugs, doing those, whoever's handing you a beer, chugging it down. So I don't know if there's any validity to this claim, again, made by someone who was in the very police force that would have been investigating her murder, saying that she was a drug user and an alcoholic. I don't know if that's factual, but whatever the case, in around the start of fall 1975, Tina ran away from home again. And by the start of October, she had been staying in Yreka, California, which is a small town just 20 miles south of the Oregon-California border, a town I know very well. It's where my mom was born and raised in, and my grandparents lived there up until my grandfather died in the early 2000s. So we would go to Yreka all the time. And it's very interesting. You know, it's not it's unlikely, but it's not obscenely unlikely. It's very possible that my mom and Tina Michelle Migis could have come into contact with each other at some point, because Tina was 17 when she died, and at the time of her death, my mom was like 14 years old, living in Yreka, and she was, by her own admission, she was often out and about, wandering around the town, hanging out with people, meeting new people. You had to just kind of go out and hang out because it was like a small mountain town. There was really nothing to do except hang out with your friends. And Tina was in Yreka reportedly for 5 weeks. So, you know, I wonder if my mom and her maybe stumbled onto each other at some point. It's a small town. And reportedly, here's another funny thing. I don't think there's any way in hell that this would have been the case, but I swear I remember my mom telling me about periodically random friends or random, you know, young kids in town sometimes coming and staying with them for very brief periods. And it was referenced that Tina Michelle Migis, when she first got to Yreka, stayed with a family in town. And I almost wonder, was that my mom's family? Probably a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, but you know, that popped into my head. And in addition to this family, she also was reportedly staying with a man in town. There's no description given to how old this man was, if there was anything weird going on, or if this was just a guy that knew her or was chill, that she was this, you know, young girl just wandering around the world, you know, just hitching it around and just seeing things and just being a free spirit. She was staying with this guy, and she'd been reported missing. She was regarded as a ward of the court. The I forget what the organization is, but essentially, the child, what would have been comparable to like Child Protective Services, had a file on her. And I believe that division was actually, there was a caseworker there, I'm assuming her caseworker, who actually was the one who reported her missing later on when she was supposed to be coming home from Yreka. And so she'd been missing for, again, it's 5 weeks. And again, it's the 1970s. You can't, we didn't have the technology we did. You can't text someone. You can't track their cell phone to figure out where they are, all this stuff. Everything is moving at a snail's pace. So she was able to linger relatively undetected for over a month until she was pulled over. And I guess what was a basic traffic stop. And she was with this guy in his car, and the police were able to determine that she was this runaway who'd been missing from Portland for a couple weeks. So the jig was up at that point, and essentially the resolution that was reached, that a lot of people agree this would not be how they would handle it these days, but it was mid-1970s, it was a different time. It was determined that they would buy her a bus ticket on a Greyhound bus, have it pick her up from Yreka, and take her back home. It was as simple as that. Which, when you've got someone who's a frequent runaway, you're putting a lot on the line when you say, hey, get on this bus for this, 6, 7, 8 hour bus ride all the way up to Portland, and we're going to trust you to stay on that bus and not leave. It seemed pretty unlikely that that was going to be what happened, but that was the decision that was made. So it was October 3rd, approximately 1 p.m., that Tina was taken to the bus station there in Yreka. She boarded the Greyhound bus, and they departed north, crossing the border into Oregon. The bus, which I remember going on a Greyhound bus when I was real young with my mom, and they make, periodic stops. There's like we did the bus trip from Portland to Yreka. It was essentially the same trip that Tina Michelle Migis would have been doing, only she would have been doing hers like 20 years earlier. And I remember we stopped, 4 or 5 times. I remember us stopping at McDonald's in Medford, and practically everybody on the bus got McDonald's and got food poisoning. So it was just horrendous ride home. But the bus must have stopped in Roseburg because Tina placed a call. It was said that she called a boyfriend. I don't know if that was a guy she was going steady with, or if it was just a friend who happened to be a boy, or if it was a guy that maybe she was seeing casually, that it wasn't really laid out in the information. But she contacted someone from Roseburg, so we know on that day. So we know she made it as far as Roseburg, presumably on that bus. Now, this is where things get a little shaky, nobody knows exactly for certain what happened. All we know is that 3 days later, October 6th, she is traveling with another young hitchhiker, and they both end up in Eugene, which is a little ways north of Roseburg. So for practically a 3-day period, it seems, Tina Michelle Migis is just lingering in that area between Roseburg and Eugene. It's not known if she spent most of that time in Roseburg, most of that time in Eugene, or most of that time in between the two. Or, what the circumstances might have been. Because what's interesting is it seems like she was still, like, she obviously bailed on the bus, so you think, okay, she's going to run away again, but it still seems she was trying to go north, which would make you think she's going to go towards Portland. Like, is she still trying to get home? Probably not, because why wouldn't she have just stayed on the bus? Is it possible the bus could have stopped briefly, she could have wandered off, and then the bus left without her, and she was stuck and needing to hitchhike going home? These are unfortunately questions where we don't have any definitive answers. But they're important to consider and theorize. Like, did she get off the bus permanently at Roseburg? Did she make it all the way to Eugene on the bus? What was she doing for those 3 days? Where was she during the better part of those 3 days? Was she still trying to get home? Did she just miss the bus, or did she intentionally get off? It's hard to say. But whatever the case, from Roseburg to Eugene, she's still traveling north. And the last time she is reportedly seen alive, this other hitchhiker that was traveling with her, they parted ways in Eugene, and the last time she saw Tina, she was hitchhiking along an on-ramp going north onto I-5. So she was still trying to travel northbound in the direction of Portland. And she was picked up by 2 men who were in kind of a beat-up, dirty, either light blue or light green colored, again, mid-60s van that was described as possibly being a Ford, Chevrolet, or even a GMC van. So just hearing that model in the era, I can kind of see the general vibe of what that van might have looked like. Apparently there was one side of it had primer on it, as it was described in an early article on the case, and it had windows all around, and it seemed like a lot of the windows were either blackened out or tinted. And this other hitchhiker, who was presumably the last person to see Tina alive, described her as wearing a cream-colored knit sweater, long-sleeved with a horizontal stripe across the chest, blue bell-bottom pants, and 14-inch brown leather boots that had laces on them. And as far as the 2 men that were in this van, she was able to give a pretty detailed description of the driver, but a kind of meek one of the other man in the van, who apparently was sitting more towards the back and probably you couldn't see as well. It was hard to determine whether these 2 guys were friends traveling together, or if this guy that was with the driver was just another hitchhiker. The fact that he was kind of sitting towards the back is a little interesting. You'd think if they were friends, or even if he was just a random hitchhiker, wouldn't he be sitting up front in the passenger seat? So it's a little interesting, but who's to say what that actually means? The description of the driver, he was described as a white male, approximately 6 feet tall, 165 to 175 pounds, and in his mid-20s. He had light-colored hair that kind of was down over his ears, and his hair was described as coarse and straight. And he had a heavy blonde mustache, kind of the opposite of this dark stubble that I have. And when I saw that description, I immediately flashed on another case I did a video on a while back about these 2 girls that I referenced earlier, Stephanie Ann Newsom and Ann Ellenwood. And there was a man that a lot of scrutiny fell onto, and a lot of people think he was guilty. And in this moment, I can't remember his full name. I just remember Chambers was his last name, and he was a guy that lived in Sweet Home. And not long after these 2 girls disappeared, he drove off to kind of a desolate rural logging road and committed suicide. And in that moment, it killed any opportunity of really definitively proving he was guilty. But I remember seeing pictures of this guy. And again, these cases, these 2 girls that disappeared were in the late 70s, so a couple years after Tina Michelle Migis. And this Chambers guy, he had kind of scruffy blonde hair, and he had a really thick blonde mustache. The problem was, I'm pretty sure he was considerably older than mid-20s by the mid-70s. So this guy was probably a lot younger than him, but that description immediately made me think of him. And here's a guy that a lot of people think was responsible for abducting a couple girls in the Salem-Corvallis area just a couple years later. But based on the age, I think that kind of puts the nail in the coffin of that guy possibly being responsible for what happened to Tina, which of course we're still getting to. So approximately 4:30 p.m. October 6th, Tina is seen getting into this van with these 2 mystery men who to this day have never been identified, and they leave traveling north on I-5, heading generally in the direction of Salem, and then Portland's, 40 miles past that. And again, the last time we see Tina alive, late afternoon of October 6th. At 3:51 p.m. October 7th, it's the following day, almost 24 hours later, a young boy was heading home and traveling along the 9700 block of River Road in the vicinity of Salem. It's a little bit of kind of an open area, even today it is. And he stumbled onto the body of a young girl, presumably, in this ditch off to the side of the road. It was the body without the head. The head had been cut off, and the kid understandably freaked and ran home and told his father what had happened. His father contacted the police. Authorities reported to the scene, and they had a headless body to investigate now, which is hard to determine the identity of someone based on that. I guess apparently Tina did still, like, she had her fingerprints, so they could have possibly used that to identify her, but they wouldn't need to, because it would be less than a day before the last little piece of physical information was uncovered in this case, and that was the following day, which would have been October 8th, 1975, around 9 a.m. along a road called Labish Center Road, running little ways east of Salem, several miles from where this body was found on the 7th. There was a farmer attending to his onion field, and he discovered the head of somebody. Now, early newspaper reports said this head was found in a field, so presumably in the field he was tending to. Later articles, including one I read in the 90s, said that he noticed her head in the middle of the street, meaning like he looked up from his field and saw her head laying in the middle of Lubish Center Road. So I'm not sure which one of those is accurate, and there's a great deal of difference in why the head would be put in a random field and why it would be put in the middle of the street. If it's put in the middle of the street, it's almost like whoever did this intentionally put it there to really shake people up or to scare someone. And so either way, it was very strange that this body without a head is left along one rural stretch of road way off to one part of Salem, and then a head is found the following day way off to another area near Salem, several miles apart. And ultimately, by the following day, Tina's sister and brother-in-law came down, and they were able to positively identify this body and this head as belonging to Tina Michelle Migis. So sometime between, if she's picked up in Eugene at 4:30, sometime probably no earlier than 5:30 or 6 p.m. the night of the 6th into the early morning hours of the 7th, or sorry, of the 7th, she would have been killed. And it was determined on an initial examination of her body that she had likely died of strangulation, asphyxiation, and that it had occurred on, they were pretty certain that she had been killed the same day that her headless body had been found, which again was October 7th. So it was believed she was killed the day after she was picked up by these guys, and probably killed not too long, at most just a couple hours before her body was found by this young boy who just happened to stumble upon it. And that's an important detail because it provides this several-hour period from the last time she's seen to the general time period it is believed she was killed. So it's not so easy to just say these two guys that picked her up might be responsible. They're just, at this time and place, they're kind of the best suspects we have because they're the quintessential last people to be seen with someone when they were alive. However, they could have driven her north, dropped her off somewhere on the way to Salem, dropped her off in Salem, and she could have, possibly been picked up by another car, and that person was responsible for killing her. She could have gotten off around Salem and, was walking around the area, and she just met the wrong person, and that person ended up killing her again. We just don't know. This case is so shrouded in mystery. All we know about the last almost 4 days of Tina Michelle Migis' life is that she got on a bus, she made it to Eugene and got into a van with some guys in Eugene, and then was killed. That's all we know definitively about the last couple days of her life. Everything is so shrouded in mystery. Something I noticed was early articles, the first articles posted about this case said it, even when she'd been examined and it was determined that she'd been, strangled to death, they didn't know yet whether she had been sexually assaulted. And in later articles I read, I didn't see that question addressed. So that's something that's been kind of left up in the air, is whether she was sexually assaulted by her captor, because that makes all the difference in the world. Was she killed by some crazy, sex-hungry rapist killer? Or was she killed by someone who maybe just killed her because she was a victim of opportunity and they just like killing? Like, the type of killer that would have done this, it becomes a lot easier to kind of point in a certain direction of who that person is if it's known whether she was sexually assaulted or not. And obviously, they probably analyzed it and figured out definitively whether she was or wasn't. I just couldn't find a straight answer in any information I read. Articles from that time, even articles written a few years later, it seemed like that question was not really addressed again after it was first mentioned in these early articles. So it's another piece of information in this case that's kind of left to mystery. I'm sure some way that information can be found. Somebody out there probably knows the answer, but as far as I could find in my research, I could not determine whether she had been sexually assaulted by her killer. Now, that's not to say that there weren't little details that came out, but they were details that unfortunately didn't really go anywhere. There was a girl named Tanya Harbison who lived during that time. She was close to being Tina, same age as Tina, and she lived really close to where her body was found. And she said that she remembered around 2 a.m. the night before her body was found, hearing tires speeding away from the general vicinity of their home. Was that the car being driven by the person who killed her? It seems fairly likely because, again, the area even today is very desolate. If there was a lot of homes there and a lot of random people with random cars, someone's at a house at a party, someone wants to show off to their buds by speeding away, that's, it's more plausible that there would be an innocent reason why you'd hear someone speeding away. But when you're in this very open area where there's not a lot of other people around, there's not really especially in the middle of the night, if you're going to be making that much noise and speeding away from an area, you probably have a pretty significant reason for doing so. And there was also talk that Tina may have known or had stayed with someone periodically in Salem, which maybe, if that's true, maybe that's where she was going. Maybe that's the reason she was continuing to head north. Maybe that's why she ultimately ended up in the vicinity of Salem. But on October 23rd of 1975, so this is about 2.5 weeks after Tina was murdered, an individual contacted the police and said that he had, about a month or so earlier, he had given Tina a ride. He picked her up hitchhiking, and that during their drive, she said that she had known someone who lived on Madrona Avenue, which is a stretch in Salem. And so police immediately started canvassing homes there to see if they could find someone who she may have known, someone she may have stayed with regularly. maybe this guy misheard, maybe she was lying to him, but if she was telling the truth, then that means somebody had something to hide, because when authorities scoped out these houses, it was reported that they got no new leads on it. It seemed nobody, they went to like every home on this road, and nobody seemed to have anything to offer in relation to the Migis case. And of course, if somebody was living on that street that she was staying with, they'd probably, even if they were innocent, they would probably have good reason to not say anything, because this girl has just died in this graphic, horrible way, and they would probably not want to get mixed up in that. So that was a brief spark lead that unfortunately went nowhere. And then what is very interesting and kind of telling about how the authorities in the Salem, Marion County area were behaving at this time, because it seems like they weren't very interested in really, hitting the grind and really figuring out what happened to this 17-year-old runaway. Again, being one of these young teenagers who runs off, there are these cases where, it's easy for law enforcement to just say, oh, well, they lived recklessly and they paid for it, which is not a justifiable reason to say, oh, we're not going to put our best effort forward. But it's easy to make excuses when a hitchhiker is killed. Well, you shouldn't have done it. Fine, we understand that. We understand that even better now than we did back then. But that still doesn't justify what happened to this young person. And it just didn't seem like law enforcement was really all that invested in figuring this case out. And I think it's because of who this victim was. This was just another teenage runaway that was probably going to get herself killed one day anyway. And that kind of this kind of dismissive attitude that I feel was probably pretty strong in the local law enforcement, at least the law enforcement individuals that were dealing with this case. Even when the case was revived in 2008, some cold case investigators started looking into the case again, and even they said, these cold case worker for Marion County, the same police force, essentially said that she was giving, essentially her case was not given the attention it deserved. So even this cold case person 30 years later pretty much was kicking the county police there in the ass, saying you did not pay enough attention to this case, and your lack of attention may have played a role in why we still haven't figured out who was responsible for this. Maybe it wouldn't, but you still have to put the effort forward. So it's October 29th, 1975, so almost a week after this mystery man on Madrona Avenue turned up no new leads, no new possible suspects. So it's been about 3 weeks since Tina's death. And two young guys, Gary Butler and Bud Crabb, which sound like two people from like the 30s, they were out driving near the 6100 block of Windsor Island Road North. This is another road kind of in the vicinity, in the Salem area. And as they were driving, it was around 12:30 a.m. The police call that these two guys made was at 12:31, so it's probably sometime between 12:25 and 12:30. They're driving along, and they make something out along the side of the road. They pull out a flashlight and flash it on it, and they immediately notice it as a body. So here we are 3 weeks later, and we have another body dumped along the side of a somewhat rural road in the vicinity of Salem. So these guys are freaked out. It's the middle of the night. They've just found a body. Everybody in town is talking about the Tina Michelle Migis murder. So everybody knows that this, practically this same event happened just a couple weeks earlier. So they immediately call the police. They then wait, by their account, for over an hour for law enforcement to show up. And by the time law enforcement shows up and they lead the police to the site where they saw this body, there's nothing there. The guys said it was, it was even though by that point there was nothing there, the grass had been flattened, it was abundantly clear that something had been left there and then moved. So these guys that stumbled onto the scene said, during that hour that we had to wait for whatever reason, somebody moved this body. And I believe it was Gary Butler, who said that because they got away from the body and waited a short distance away, because if a body's been dumped there, who knows if the killer's close by. And he said that he saw taillights of a car in the vicinity, off in the distance, in the vicinity of where they saw this body. They saw a car and taillights. And so, he figured, well, whoever was in that car probably picked the body up. And again, they say that there was, the grass was flattened down. There was a firm imprint of where something once was. Well, the officers who responded to the crime scene, or the potential crime scene, said they found no evidence that a body was there, they didn't find a body, and they found no evidence that a body was there. So what the police say and what these two guys say are completely different. So it is kind of, who are you going to believe at this point? But it really kind of showed, this kind of negligent attitude that law enforcement had in the area. And I even wrote down the quotes from the sheriff that was kind of overseeing the Tina Michelle Migis case, and now this new potential discovery, who is a guy named Bob Prinslow, who said the account these guys gave was likely more just rumor spreading than anything else, and that everyone was really freaked out by the Tina Michelle Migis murder, and there were a lot of rumors going around, which is just, whether you believe these guys or not, that was such an irresponsible thing to say, to just immediately wipe what these guys said off the table. And maybe these guys were lying, maybe they were trying to get attention, but it seems like authorities were real quick to take forever to show up at the crime scene and then just kind of say, well, nothing's here, so that's it. We're not going to talk about it anymore. This is, again, this very lazy, negligent attitude that makes me wonder, I wonder why Tina Michelle Migis' case was never solved. And my attitude in doing this series, obviously I'm addressing a lot of unsolved cases. It is not my objective to churn out videos and just every video be like, oh, well, the police must have done a crappy job, and that's why, the thing was never resolved. That, I just, I look at the information, I bring to you that information, and then, I'm going to give my perspective on something. And if I feel like law enforcement dropped the ball, I'm going to say it. And I feel like they dropped the ball in this case. And again, cold case worker 30 years later said the exact same thing about, essentially the very police force they were working for. And it was astonishing. This is why it's so weird to me that this case is so obscure amongst unsolved murders in Oregon. Is this case had such a dramatic effect on the people in the area. Even by late November, she's been dead for almost 2 months. There were articles being written specifically about the lingering effects that this had had on people in the Salem area. More parents were buying firearms. More parents were driving their kids to school instead of letting them walk or letting them catch a bus. There was an article that quoted a local barber in the area that said he expressed what a lot of husbands were expressing, which was to simply state, my wife is scared out of her mind. And there was, high school kids, girls were particularly freaked out about this, while apparently most guys were just kind of like, oh, well, I'm not too worried about it. And it's like, yeah, well, you're a guy. You're not a 17-year-old teenage girl that just got decapitated in your city. If I was a teenage girl going to school and that happened right outside of town, and I think, oh, there's a guy in my town wandering around killing girls and decapitating them, yeah, I'm going to be freaked out. But, the guys in town just didn't seem to get that. And another thing I stumbled onto, there was a really lengthy kind of editorial piece written November 8th, 1975, so about a month after Tina was killed, and she was she was the lead-in kind of reference. So she was almost a catalyst to this article that delved into the dangers, specifically of young women hitchhiking, which, even back then, like, people were getting more woke to how dangerous hitchhiking was in the 1970s, but not anywhere near where we're at now. Now it's just like, do not hitchhike, never hitchhike, unless it is a life or death situation. And it was so troubling to read, because the article was written by a woman who had picked up a lot of young women hitchhikers, and she was imparting what they said about it. And a lot of these young women were just, they had such a passive attitude about it. Some of them, and, they would say they would get picked up by men, and, a lot of men would expect them to have sex with them. And a lot of them would just suck it up and do it. One girl told her, like, well, that was essentially me paying for my ride. She said she spoke to, one girl that she picked up, and the girl was like, oh yeah, I've been hitchhiking for years and years. And this girl was only like, I don't even know if she was 20 yet. And so it was just really troubling to read. And then there was included interviews done with guys who were serving prison in Oregon specifically for raping women that they picked up as hitchhikers. And just listening to what these disgusting bastards had to say on the matter. And one of them, a guy who was only mentioned as Jack, was your chronic serial rapist who, when asked, did you go after these girls because they were wearing cute little skimpy outfits or whatever? And he said, no, it was never about how pretty the girl was. In fact, some of the girls I picked up I didn't think were attractive, but it was about, me being able to dominate them. Sound like a rapist? And I took down a particular quote that this guy named Jack said that really gets at the heart, I think, of where this guy's mind at, and how a lot of these random sketchy guys that are riding the highways and freeways of our country and looking for random young women to pick up. In terms of like the type of, getting a woman that he picked up to have sex with him, he said, quote, I do figure that if a woman dresses sloppy, her morals are sloppy. Like if she didn't care how she looks, then she don't give a fuck what anybody does to her. And so, as time passed, like so many other cases, this case became more and more forgotten. The leads dried up, the potential suspects dried up. Even the evidence is starting to dry up. Apparently, by the 90s, only 20 years later, it was reported that a lot of the evidence in her case couldn't even be used for DNA testing because it had been essentially just left neglected in, some warehouse building somewhere, and some of it was growing mold on it, and apparently rodents had gotten to it. So, at this point, even DNA analysis seems unlikely in Tina's case, and that's one of the only real ways that a lot of these cases are getting resolved. Again, just a few months back in the fall of 2020, they finally figured out who this skull of a woman that they found in 1986 near Mount Hood. Just last October, they found out who she was through this particular method of DNA testing and determining who her ancestor. That's becoming a real big thing now, which I think is great, is that they're able to identify, relatives of a victim and then use that to track from them to who the actual victim is. And it seems like things like that it's incredibly unlikely that that will happen in this case, which is unfortunate and horribly tragic. And Tina was just becoming another one of these victims that was getting lost in the shuffle of all these unsolved murders that were happening in the Salem-Corvallis area in the 70s and into the early 80s. Again, some of which were solved later on down the line, but unfortunately this case was not one of those. And, by the end of 1975, start of 1976, even the newspaper articles I was searching under various, Tina Migis, just Migis, Tina Michelle Migis, dismember, any of the things you could search under to try to find more cases that might not pop up in a search. The articles on this case dried up by the start of 1976, and I only found 2 articles after that. One was from 1996 and one was from 2008. There was a 2007 article that was just referencing still unsolved murder cases in Marion, the kind of Salem, Marion County area. And they do reference Tina Michelle Migis' case, but it's just like her name listed with a bunch of others and then just a brief description of what happened. So it didn't really bring anything else to light. But I randomly discovered, and I didn't find this in any other information, but in this 1996 article that admittedly I felt wasn't very well written. It referenced this is where I also saw the reference that she was described as being a drug user and an alcoholic. It was from this article. Haven't seen the information bore out anywhere else. And this article also mentions something that I found in no other information, which was that a trucker claimed to see her on the side of the road on October 6th, again, near I-5, but she was up by Woodburn, which is a town that's a little ways north of Salem. So on the same day that she is picked up in Eugene, she's seen hitchhiking again near Woodburn. Now, I haven't seen this information anywhere else, and maybe this was just a mixed up amalgamation, alteration of what the hitchhiker in Eugene said about her hitchhiking by the freeway and getting picked up by a van. And this truck driver could have also been mistaken about who he saw, but it's very strange that this information has not been bore out in any other information that I've found. It's just in this one article. And it's also interesting because if this is an accurate account, Tina has now passed Salem to Woodburn, and then within hours, really, she's back in the vicinity of Salem and murdered. Now, she could have been picked up in Woodburn and deposited there after death, but I seriously question that claim that this trucker saw her in the vicinity of Woodburn. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's possible, but I have to question its relevancy. And then something else that I saw in this article that I didn't find in any other articles about it, and you'd think this would pop up unless, you know, it's really tragic what happened, because it could have possibly blown the lid open on this case. And maybe the fact that it didn't happen, newspapers just decided, well, we're not going to talk about it then. You know, why make a horribly depressing situation worse? But according to this 1996 article, shortly after Tina was killed, the evidence in her case was sent to a prominent lab in California for fiber analysis that they wanted compared to a possible suspect who had apparently killed and dismembered at least 2 different women. Now, the problem with this article is that they don't give that suspect's name, they don't give the victims' names, they don't say where these victims were killed, what years it happened, if it was even in Oregon. I tried for a long time doing general searches. I looked on like Murderpedia. I looked up random search terms in, 73, 74, 75, leading up to this case, trying to see if maybe I could get a line on who this particular suspect was, who was given a name, and I really couldn't. The closest thing I found was a guy, and this didn't fit because these victims weren't dismembered, and I don't even think they were seriously thinking this guy was guilty of those murders at the time. But there was a surprisingly not well-known serial killer who ultimately ended up, he killed in various areas, but he's kind of regarded as an Oregon serial killer because this is where he was caught. And he was a guy named Bobby Jack Fowler, who killed possibly as many as like 20 people. But it's thought that he was responsible for killing at least 2 women, possibly 3, in Canada around the time of 1972, 1973. So I was thinking maybe that's him, because 1973 is right before 75, and it's, 2 possible women, but apparently these women were not dismembered. And again, I don't think Bobby Jack Fowler really came under suspicion of those cases till a little ways later on, ways past when Tina was killed. So that was the closest thing I found, and I don't really think it applies to this situation, unfortunately. So I was not able, if I could have figured out who that guy was, I could have done, more in-depth research on that person and looked into how he did what he did. But all I have is a mystery suspect who apparently dismembered a couple of women. And there was another woman named Betty Lucille Wilson, whose dismembered body was found in a slough, I believe near Salem. and she'd been all hacked up and dismembered. And this was just a couple months before Tina Michelle Migis was killed. And it was found out that she was the victim of Richard Marquette, who was another fairly prominent serial killer of Oregon lineage. But Richard Marquette was apprehended during the midsummer of 1975. So if you want to look at him as a possible suspect in Tina Michelle Migis's case, it's impossible. He was in jail at the time of her death. But still, getting back to this particular story, so the evidence in her case was sent in relation to this mystery suspect to this California lab for analysis. And reportedly, after a few days, authorities in Marion County get this very excited call from the doctor, or the technician. I don't know why I said doctor. The technician who was analyzing this evidence, who was apparently very excited and said, like, I'm catching a plane to Oregon right now. So it seems like this guy found something pretty significant. He had probably found strong evidence showing that this particular suspect was tied to Tina and thus likely tied to her murder. And it's frustrating, the fact that I can't figure out who this suspect was. I'll probably keep digging at some point, because if I find someone from around that time that had killed and dismembered at least 2 different women and I get a name on it, and then I reflect back on this particular instance, I'm probably going to figure that's the person that was responsible for killing Tina Michelle Migis. But to this point, like, I have such a vague chunk of information to go on that even if I found someone likely, I probably wouldn't even be able to, even in my own mind, definitively think, yeah, I think this guy's responsible. So this tech hopped a plane, and apparently, I almost question this story. It's just so insane. Apparently the plane lands, the technician gets off, he's ready to divulge his information to local authorities. Right after the plane lands, this technician has a heart attack and dies. And apparently he had just found out this information. He hadn't written up a report. He hadn't left any information showing what he had found behind. And beyond that, his work wasn't redone by somebody else afterwards, which is really bizarre to me. Why would you not just get another tech in there to redo this if this guy clearly had some major bombshell to drop? So I don't know why that happened, but it's just a strange, crazy case. This guy dies literally minutes before he's going to unveil his apparently very significant findings to law enforcement. And then it was just, it disappeared. And I'm really bothered by the fact that they didn't, maybe they had a reason why they couldn't have done it, but it really bothers me that these tests weren't redone by another technician of some kind. It doesn't make sense to me that you wouldn't at least try to do that again. And that's really, so that's very much left up in the air. And again, I wish I could figure out who this mystery suspect was in question. And then there was really only one more article that I found on the matter, which was from 2008, expressing that investigators were going to begin looking back into this case again. And unfortunately, this was over 12 years ago. And to this day, it's still an unsolved murder. It's still there on Marion County's cold case website. Again, a lot of the evidence is not of much value. And time continues to pass. It's now been over 45 years since her murder. So it's not too long ago. It's not outside. Obviously, it's not anywhere near outside the realm of possibility in terms of being solved one day. But the odds just continue to be more and more stacked against it with a lack of evidence. Again, somebody would have to be harboring a personal account of what happened. Whoever, if it was somebody who was, maybe in their mid-20s, That's somebody who would be about 70 years old today. The killer could possibly still be alive. We don't know. It's just there's a lot of the odds are very long. The deck is very stacked against this particular case ever being solved, which is horribly unfortunate. It's tragic enough that this case is generally forgotten, because I've found a lot more information about other solved and unsolved cases that happened around this same time in the same area. But the case of Tina Michelle Migis, you really have to dig, 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 and dig in order to find anything. And I'm literally bearing to you every single little minute detail I was able to find on this case, because there's not really a whole lot. I've been able to cram pretty much everything you can find researching this into this video. And like everything else, every other case I cover, I keep my hope alive, and I really hope this will be solved one day. And this is my one little tiny way of keeping obscure and forgotten tragedies like this from being even more so forgotten, just trying to keep them alive. Even if only 50 people watch this and think about this case and think about this, girl that was killed so horribly. And it's a case that a lot of people didn't seem to really care about because she was just a runaway teen. These are the kind of cases that I hope really make people think, because this was the life of a human being. And just because she was a runaway doesn't make her murder any less important than the murder of a billionaire somewhere else. So that is it. That is, again, just about everything I was able to pull up in terms of the case of the unsolved decapitation murder of Tina Michelle Migis back in October of 1975. And I hope it's solved one day. So again, as always, thank you so much for watching this long series I'm doing. I really think these cases deserve attention, and a lot of them get little to no attention. So I'm just trying to keep them alive and keep them at least a little bit in the public's mind. All that said, again, thank you so much for watching. And once more, again, if you want to support this channel, help keep me growing, help the momentum keep moving, remember to like, share, subscribe. I have a Patreon page if you want to help me out there. It allows me to dedicate more time and energy to videos such as this. The link to that is in the description of this video, as well as the link to my Instagram and Facebook pages that are related to the kind of content that I do on my channel. And all of that said, till next time, everybody, once again, thank you for watching. Until next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.